Welcome back to the Postpartum Plan Podcast. This podcast is designed to support and empower you through postpartum. Whether you're expecting, in the early postpartum days, or beyond, this space is for you. I'm your host, Madison Fugere, a dedicated postpartum doula and pediatric sleep consultant, striving to help parents feel confident and supported in their parenting journey. Each week, I'm sharing practical tips and expert advice to help you navigate all the postpartum things with confidence. Well, as much confidence as you can. Let's embark on this journey together, making your parenthood as serene and supportive as possible. Katie is a non-diet registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, certified lactation counselor, and a mom of a 4 and 2-year-old. She provides virtual and in-person nutrition counseling for children, teens, adults, and families. She utilizes compassionate guidance and evidence-based strategies to support clients in finding food freedom and body respect that feels authentic and empowering to them. I'm so excited to have you with me today, Katie. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to it.
We were just saying and kind of like talking about touching base on what we were going to chat about during this episode. And I was saying how multiple of my clients have been like, do you have a podcast episode on, starting solids? Because it's such a nerve-wracking thing, I think, especially for first-time parents. So I'm super excited to kind of like tackle the topic of introducing solids with your little one here and kind of talking about what avenues people can take and, what tools that are helpful during this process and all that jazz. But first, do you want to tell everybody a little bit about yourself and, kind of your background, and then we'll jump into it?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Katie Badger, and I own Everybody Nutrition Counseling. I'm a registered dietitian. I am also a certified intuitive eating counselor, which I can certainly explain what that means if you have questions about it. I'm also a certified lactation counselor. I've been a dietitian for over 5 years now. And I work with everybody, so I don't just work with kids, but kids are definitely have always been sort of the area that I've been most drawn to in dietetics and nutrition. And I would say that, I learned about it in school, but it wasn't really until I had my own children who are now 4 and 2 that I was like, it's so much more than the textbooks, right? It's
Absolutely.
not black and white. So it's really brought it to life for me and helped me kind of think maybe be more a little empathetic to people who are like, I'm starting out and I don't know what to do. And it's a little bit terrifying. I can relate to that. And I had a lot of information going into it. It was still like a scary process. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
So as you were talking and I was just thinking about some of like the things we can chat about, one thing that just came to mind, and I don't know if you have like a specific stance on this, and I'm sure that we could go on to talk about this in a whole different episode, but like maybe just a quick breeze over. I know some pediatricians will tell people to wait till about 6 months for kiddos to eat. Some are saying that you can do it between the ages of 4 and 6 months. Some people are saying, your kiddo just needs to be able to sit up on their own. Like, what really is the milestone markers that we're looking for? And should it be based on skill and milestone markers, or is it more based on like age?
Yeah, so I definitely go based more off of milestone markers. So
Okay.
things like being able to sit up on a pretty unassisted. It doesn't have to be like perfect, but we want to think about the safety factor, right? If a kid
Right.
is like toppling over, that's not going to be that safe if they've got food in their mouth. You want them interested. So like if you ever have your baby at the table with you and they're like looking at your food, like, why aren't you sharing that with me, right? That's kind of an indicator that they might be ready.
Right.
Also bringing things to their mouth, right? We want that sort of
Right.
interest. So like picking up toys, pulling them to their mouth is a big one. There, that usually happens around 6 months, but right, we all develop like slightly differently. So if it's
Right.
5 months, if it's 8 months, like, there's differences in how people develop. And so it's much better to go based off of the signs of readiness than like some hard and fast rule around age.
That's great to know because I do think people obviously want to do what's best for their kiddo. And I think that there are so many mixed signals out there about like what to do. And as a new parent, especially if this is your first kiddo, I find that everybody's giving you like slightly different information. And so you try to kind of find like one common denominator. And so I think it can be helpful for people to kind of hear from somebody who is in that realm, what to really look for. Because pediatricians are great, but they have to know so much stuff that sometimes it's not up to date with everything.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not always, I still hear a lot of people saying 4 months and or 6 months, and they using that as the hard and fast rule. But the research definitely supports the signs of readiness as the a good marker.
Absolutely. Okay, cool. Now it's time for babies to eat, and where do we start, right? I guess the first kind of thing that we can tackle is people either go the traditional, like air quotes, people can't see that I'm doing, traditional puree route, or people have been more looped into this baby-led weaning thing now, right? And what is this baby-led weaning thing? And then, yeah, what are the pros and cons to doing those? And, what might be right for one family and what might be right for another family are different. But getting some, could you give us some information about the different paths people could take and kind of what those first steps might look like?
Yeah, I guess I want to say first that there's no one right way to do it. So, baby-led weaning there's a lot of great things about it. I'm definitely a fan of it, but it's not for everybody. And that's totally okay. You're not like messing anything up by going the puree route. And I think it's also really important to kind of consider when you're starting feeding, like what are your feeding goals? And
Right.
so, when I'm thinking about feeding children, I'm concerned that like I want them to grow well, like meaning grow the way they're supposed to grow. Not, I don't actually really care about like where they fall on their growth curve, but I want them to follow their own curve. And I want them to kind of live up to their genetic potential, essentially. So, like,
Right.
that's an important piece to it when you're thinking about how you want to feed and how you're approaching food with kids. I also want them to, get all the nutrients that they need so that they can develop appropriately. So that's also kind of a factor, obviously, that goes into how you might be approaching it. So from that position, I'm definitely thinking I lean towards the baby-led weaning in general because it's very responsive, but you
Mhm.
can feed purees responsively too. I think either direction that you take, and we can talk about them in more detail, but either direction you take, responsive feeding is going to be sort of the gold standard because we want to respect your little ones like appetite and
Right.
interest in food and feeling comfortable. We don't want any force feeding going on. We don't actually want to play the airplane game. I feel like that's like what I think about when I think about feeding babies,
Right.
like here comes the choo-choo train kind of thing. And we don't need to manipulate them into opening their mouth. Like you know, assuming everything is kind of like going well and smoothly, right? And there's obviously nuances to this. It's not one size fits all, but in
Right.
general, like we don't need to coerce kids to eat. It's
I think that's what we're doing with this whole pace bottle feeding education that we do as well, right? Like, you're letting the kiddo lead the way. You're letting them decide what they're willing to take and what they want to take and respecting non their nonverbal no, right? And reading
exactly.
those signs and cues, which can sound like super modern world words, right? Compared to like just being like, you just feed the baby, it's fine, right? Like they can't talk. How are they like telling you yes and no? But they can, right? And like just kind of watching them and like cueing into their nonverbal, like, and their facial expressions and how they react. And maybe, like you said, if they reach for things, I think can be so huge.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when you first start feeding a baby, right? If you go with breastfeeding, right, it's really hard to make a baby breastfeed more than they want to, right?
Mm-hmm.
When it's a bottle, it becomes like slightly easier to be like, well, I just have an ounce left. Why don't you just, finish
Right.
it off so I don't waste it, but they definitely give you those signals right from the
Absolutely.
get-go, really.
Absolutely. So if families decide to go with this baby-led weaning, like, can you explain a bit more about like what it is and then how the process goes when you are doing a baby-led weaning feeding?
Yeah. So I sometimes it can be interchangeable with baby-led feeding because I think weaning makes you think you're like stopping breast milk or formula, which
Right.
isn't what's happening, right? It's really just adding in complementary foods. For that first year of life, we're really focusing on, the breast milk or formula.
Right.
And so this is their opportunity to learn to like foods and figure out how to eat foods and advance from, just a liquid diet. So with baby-led weaning or feeding, you, sorry, you are giving your baby, table foods. So that might look like, a first food maybe is like a strip of like avocado, right? Something that's kind of, you can like, press between two fingers pretty easily. You want it to be something that's like long and skinny, kind of like the size of like an adult pinky finger is like a kind of a good measure.
Mm-hmm.
But you want them to be able to like pick it up themselves and like gnaw on it, right? So they don't have any, they can't like, they don't have their pincer grasp yet at this point. So they're not like
Right.
picking like up a Cheerio or something. They need something that they can like physically grab, like a piece of broccoli, right? And they're just like, they can gnaw on it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think there's a common misnomer that babies need teeth in order to eat food like that. And really, like, their jaws are quite strong. So, like, they just
Oh
need to
yeah.
be able to manipulate it to their back.
Any
And,
breastfeeding parent will totally agree with you on that one too.
exactly. So, it's, that's not necessary. So, basically, you're starting off right from the get-go with table foods. You're not pureeing it and you're not putting it in their mouth, which is actually makes it really safe. So I think that's, always the big concern is like, what do you mean I'm going to give my baby that's never had anything but liquids to eat, right? That seems
Right.
terrifying. But what's really cool is that babies actually have a gag reflex that's like further forward in their mouth. And so this is a protective mechanism for them. So they actually will, not always, but they usually will gag a little bit when they start eating, which from a parent perspective is absolutely terrifying. But as long
Absolutely.
as your baby is like coughing, making noise, doing all those things, that is not choking. That's very different. If they're not
Mm-hmm.
making any sound, that, requires intervention.
Mm-hmm.
I always suggest people like when they start off, it's good to get certified, like learn about how
I
to
was
manage
just
that.
gonna say that. Yeah, it's always great. I think one of the first steps before you even start introducing food to your kiddo is to take and make sure you have like, a first aid safety or choking typed course for your kiddo. And I also tell a lot of my clients like, do that, but then also like in that class they'll probably tell you, but there's that little like I don't know, it's like not a jingle, but it feels like a jingle, right? The like loud and red, go ahead, quiet and blue, I need you, right? So if they're loud and they're coughing and their face is red, like they can do it themselves, right? But it's the moments that we're quiet and they start to change like more to the blue tint, that they need your assistance in getting that food out. And I think that those classes are definitely helpful in preparing you for that gagging because it does happen.
Yeah. And I mean, the truth is they can choke with purees and gag with purees just the
Right.
same. And in fact, when you're putting something in somebody else's mouth, you're increasing the risk of choking more so than when they're manipulating it
Mm-hmm.
themselves. In giving them table foods, you're certainly not giving them, like a grape in its whole form, right?
Right.
That would be a perfect choking hazard. It's like the perfect shape of their throat. So we're not going that route, but you can give them grapes and cut it into quarters, things like that. So just, there's certainly choking hazard things that you want to be mindful of, but in
Right.
general, this is a very safe way to go about feeding your little one, which I know is always like kind of the biggest kind of drawback, I think, for people on
Yeah.
it.
Now, are there like when it comes to so you're giving your child essentially just a cut down version of your own meal, right? And now when it comes to, like you said, pinky-sized finger typed long strips of things are great. Are there specific ways or things that you suggest preparing in specific ways when you are giving them to a kiddo? Or in like your nutritional kind of side of things and dietary kind of side of things, are there specific foods that kiddos should be getting early on or shouldn't be getting early on? I know a lot of people will talk about, certain minerals or vitamins that kiddos need. And so they might offer, some foods more often than others or things like that.
Yeah, so once you introduce solids like that, the goal is really to introduce a variety of foods. So it's not that we're like sticking to like one thing over another, but at this point, like around 6 months, iron stores start to kind of deplete. And if you're breastfeeding, if baby's only getting breast milk at this point, iron stores are getting depleted. Your breast milk isn't a great source of iron, which, I guess, so that like at that point, as your iron stores start to deplete, it makes sense that they kind of need to get it some other way at that point.
Right.
Formula is, has iron in it, so you don't see that as much if a baby is on formula. However, you still want to like prioritize iron-rich foods. So that's like something that can be helpful. Thinking about getting plenty of, animal proteins is obviously going to be your best source of iron. It's the most like absorbable source, but you can also
Mhm.
use vegetarian sources, paired with like vitamin C rich things helps to make iron more absorbable.
Mm.
So like, um, for example, like just trying to think of like a good baby food, but like beans, for example, are like high in iron. If you have that like alongside something that has like citrus in it, like a pepper or something like that, or strawberries, those are high in vitamin C. And so when you pair them together, you get a more available iron source for them.
Yeah.
So
I know
that's
that I saw
definitely,
online one dietitian who had been posting that her little one's first food was a piece of steak. And she was like, and everyone was like, I don't understand. Like, that goes to that, right? Like, you don't have teeth. Like, how are you eating that, right? But it's
Mhm.
not the fact of baby having to eat it. It's literally baby was just hanging on to it, like sucking on it, getting all the juice out, getting all that iron, right?
Yep.
Gnawing on it, getting this new texture feeling, right? And everyone in the comments is like, what is going on? What are you doing? Right. But it's the perfect size that you were talking about. It's that iron rich food. And then it's a new texture. And it was so funny. This baby was like living their best life eating this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great food, something that has like a lot of resistance like that.
Hmm.
They kind of work well almost as like a teether too, right? If you
Right.
think about like I've seen people offering like the mango, like the pit of a
The
mango when
pit of
you
the mango.
pick,
Yes.
and they can just gnaw on it and they like suck the juices off of it. And it's like a teething thing, but also an opportunity for them to kind of feel things in their mouth and kind of
Hmm.
manipulate things around in that way.
I think the big thing to remember, and like you can let listeners know if you agree or disagree either way, but like I always remind people that like there's that phrase of like right like food before one just for fun, right? Of like yeah, our main source of nutrients is breast milk or formula or some type of milk, right? Before the age of one. And so when I talk with families that are like, oh, my kiddo like isn't really eating it, they're just gnawing on it or they're just sucking the juice off, they keep gagging, they want nothing to do with it, they're not actually eating the food. It's also important to remember that like this is a sensory experience. So, like for them, this could also just be an activity that you do while they're awake. Like it doesn't need to be like a meal and then we're going to give a bottle or we're going to breastfeed after, right? Like this can be more of like an activity. And I think sometimes like experiencing it and phrasing it in your mind as, a sensory activity for your little one can sometimes help with that anxiety of like, my kid's not eating for a lot of families.
Yeah. I think with that, at first, I definitely think like no big deal. Like, when you start feeding your kids, like half the food will end up, on the floor, smeared in their hair, all the other
Right.
right places that other than their mouth. And that is totally fine. That's a sensory experience. They're navigating the food, like they're figuring out like what is it? They don't necessarily know that it's meant for their mouth even.
Right.
They're just kind of figuring it out. I'd say as you get like closer to that like 9, 10, 11, like if like no food is really getting in there, like if there are some foods that are still ending up on the floor, no big deal. But if it's like every single food, like
Mm,
then I would say maybe it's time to talk to somebody. It may not be
yeah.
a concern, but it's always helpful to like have, give yourself that peace of mind,
Right.
because you by 12 months, like they should be, they're going to be getting much more of their calories from food kind of going forward than from a milk source. And
Right.
we don't want them solely dependent on milk by the time they get to one because you do want to kind of like dial back on the milk
Right.
because for lots of reasons, but it will suppress their appetite a lot if like they're still getting,
Right.
six
Right.
more ounces of milk a day or
Hmm.
32 ounces or whatever it is that you're giving them.
Mm.
That's kind of
Very interesting. Cool. So
yeah.
now, is there any other part to the baby-led weaning or baby-led feeding that you are I know that there's when you read a baby-led feeding book, there's so many like parts to it that makes it like that true like path, right? I know people can kind of mix and mingle together, right? You might be able to do some purees and some not. I mean, some of the foods we eat as humans is like pureed. Like you can't give your kid applesauce in like a whole form, right? Um,
Exactly.
but there's other practices that I've heard and seen that kind of go along with this baby feeding, and like one of them, for example, being, parents sitting and eating with the child every time they're eating. Are there other things like that that kind of go along with this that you normally suggest to families?
So I definitely suggest whenever possible to like eat alongside your baby. I mean, a baby shouldn't be eating alone, whether you're eating at the same time or not. Like they should definitely
Right.
be supervised. But if you can eat at the same time as them, that's great because you're modeling behavior for them. And so you're like, demonstrating things. They're watching how you kind of handle things at the table, like, oh, that's interesting. Mommy doesn't throw her food on the floor or dump her spaghetti on her head, right? Like they might take those kinds of things into consideration.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so modeling behavior is probably like the best way to teach kids a new skill.
Mm-hmm.
Other things, I mean, so if your baby's in a high chair, getting them like pulled right up to the table is like, so they feel like they're part of the meal. I know lots of
Mm,
families will have like little kid-sized tables and then the kids are sitting kind of separately, but which is sweet, but then they're sort of missing out on like that observing parts, like making them feel like
right.
part of the meal, I think can be helpful. As kids kind of get like a little bit older, like into the, 9, 10, 11 months range, like serving things family style so that everybody kind of gets to decide. They're kind of seeing like what's there and they're putting like kids love serving themselves. I mean, it's messy. That's probably one of the biggest cons, I think, of baby-led feeding. It's really
It is
messy.
messy. Yeah.
Um,
Well, especially because you also mentioned one of the other things being that like kiddos are feeding themselves, right? Like they're picking up their own food and deciding what they want to eat, and parents aren't really serving it to them. Are there instances where like parents should intervene and help? Like if a kiddo is getting really frustrated that they can't pick up the slippery piece of avocado or a piece of mango keeps sliding out of their hand, like are those situations where parents can kind of like help by holding it and like allowing them to gnaw or like by feeding it to them? Or do we typically kind of like let them struggle till they learn kind of a thing?
I think if they're frustrated, it's perfectly fine to like assist. You can also like strategies, right? You could take the avocado and like roll it in some type of like flaxseed or something like that that kind of makes it easier to grip, or you could like
Mm,
leave part of the peel on the end so again it's not slimy. Um, Things like that, you can kind of help them. You can, if they're having a hard time with like loading up their own spoon, like load it up for them and then hand it to them and then they can kind of figure it out.
mm,
Um, but I think, if you want to feed it, like if they're having trouble and you want to like hold it up for them, as long as they're like leaning forward and opening their mouths, like that's
right.
responsive
They're
feeding.
an active participant in the feeding experience. Yeah.
Exactly. You're not chasing them, you're not forcing them to do anything that they don't want to do. So,
Right.
to me, that's totally reasonable to do.
Awesome. Cool. Now, if people are kind of going the puree route, are there specific purees, like brands or anything like that that you suggest, or do you suggest people do their own baby food like making? And I know that some people, will batch make things, or, some people like steam everything. Is there a specific way that people should be preparing foods for their little ones?
I definitely don't have any brand recommendations, but I would say, you know, do what works for your family. Like if buying
Right.
jarred food is like easy and it's convenient and you can afford it, or you're getting it through WIC or something like that, then like go for that. Like I don't, there's no the idea that like you have to like homemake your food and I don't think
Yeah.
that's a lot of pressure that I would
Right.
need.
Well, and I
Yeah.
think a lot of the like making your food thing too, I think so many people think it means that you have to like meal prep for your kid, right? I had one client who was like, I mean, I'm not making my baby food, but also like if I have extra vegetables from dinner and it's just going to be a leftover, like I throw it in the blender and I'm like, that's making baby food. Like, like it doesn't need to be like 14 containers of sweet potatoes. It can be, the 4 bites that you didn't eat that's left over that you throw in the blender, right? And I think
Absolutely.
people don't realize that part too and kind of forget that that is also really accurate and
Yeah.
great for kiddos.
Yeah, as long as you've got like, just like any food, whether you're giving it to them in the, table food wise or blending it, right? Like just proper, food and storage handling, getting them the
Right.
same temperature, that kind of thing to make them safe. But otherwise, yeah, there isn't like, I don't think there's a gold standard in terms of what you're giving them. And
Right.
I think, as part of my intuitive eating kind of framework, right? There's no like good food, bad food, right? We certainly want to prioritize certain foods for our babies as
Right.
they're growing, but yeah, 'cause I
That's
don't.
great to know. Now, do you have any like really big pros or cons that stand out for, each of them? Would you be able to give us like some big pros and cons or like just some like bullet points on each
Yeah.
method?
Yeah. So with puree feeding, I think, it's definitely easier in some ways, right? In some ways, it's harder because you have to like either get the pureed food or make it, right? But it's like you're in control. So like it's a lot tidier, a lot more goes into the baby. So like consumption has increased a lot with puree feeding. It's probably the thing that you're most familiar with, which, isn't always a bad thing.
Right.
I would say that the cons with puree feeding is that um, it's hard, like you have to be more like purposeful to be
Mm-hmm.
responsive. So, really letting baby kind of lead the way. Babies often will start grabbing at the spoon and things like that. So, like, be
Right.
willing to like let them do that, I think is important. You're missing out on that sensory experience of letting them touch it and like mess around with it. You're also missing out on this opportunity to like try out it. Like the flavor spectrum, I think, is a lot smaller with
Mm,
purees, and
yeah.
definitely the textures. If you use purees, the thing is that you have to, or I mean, you should advance anyways to table foods by like 8 or 9 months. Like you don't want to get stuck there. And when people get stuck there, oftentimes we see like oral like development is delayed and things like that. So
Yes.
kids they're not getting the opportunity to figure out how things work.
Mm-hmm.
And once you kind of get past that year mark, you start running into this like fear of foods thing that happens, this neophobia, right? So it's a good opportunity to like really optimize getting not just the nutrition, but it's more about the experience, like
Yeah.
getting kids familiar with things. So making sure that you are advancing it at if you're going that route is really important.
Okay.
Um, yeah. With baby-led feeding, I mean, definitely I would say the cons of it's messier. It
Mm-hmm.
can be more wasteful, but you can get around that with, serving, putting really small amounts on their tray. You can always add more food, right, if they eat it. Um, for the mess, one of my favorite, I forget which book it was, but one of the baby-led feeding books that I had read was like, first step, get a dog. They'll just clean up for
That's
you. It's fine.
great. That's great. Well, I
Like,
find a lot of my baby-led feeding families are either getting the full sleeved bibs, which I have a brand that I love. People can find it on my social media, but or just feeding your baby completely naked because just know that your clothes, their clothes, and everything around you is going to get a little bit messy. They have those like contraptions. Have you seen them? They look oh, like a large bowl that goes like around the high chair. And so if they like throw things or drop things, it catches it rather than like going on the floor. Or they have those like wipeable mats that you can like the that you can put on the ground like under. I'm like, oh my gosh, these people are making so much money. I wish I came up with it.
right? Yeah, a nice little spot. I mean, put down a towel. You could put down like a tablecloth, right? Like
Yeah.
if you're concerned. I know like whenever I would take my kids over to like, my mom's house or something like that, and there would be a rug under the table or something like that. Like we would put something down. In my house,
Yeah.
like the floor was like easily wiped. It wasn't
Right.
as
Hardwood's easy or tile, but yeah, it is
yeah.
trickier when there's rug nearby.
Yeah, or like a fabric chair nearby or things like that.
Mm,
Warn people
yes.
you have company, like you might not want to sit directly next to the baby while they're eating unless you want to wear some of the food.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Now, as it goes into kind of like feeding stuff, right? So, would you share any favorite spoons, bowls, plates, or high chairs, things like that that you find are, typically really helpful to families as they're kind of going through the feeding stages?
Yeah, I think the high chair piece, like, I mean, there's so many different high chairs on the market, and I think probably the most important thing to remember is like the positioning. So if you already
Right.
have a high chair, you don't have to like replace it. You can kind of rig it to fit your needs. So if it's like one of those kind of old school chairs that almost like recline,
Yeah.
you want your baby to be up at like a 90-degree angle. So,
Mm-hmm.
put something behind them, kind of prop them up. You also really want them to have a footrest, and that's partly for comfort, but it's also partly like part of just the mechanisms, right, of eating. But
Yeah.
if you like, like sitting on a bar stool or something, your feet are dangling, like it's not as
It's not
comfortable. You're
fun.
not going to want to sit there for very long. So we really definitely want the baby to be comfortable. We also want the tray to be like at a good height, right? If it's like up here, like that, or up to your chin, sorry. They can see.
There's no video. I know. They'll know what you mean though. Yeah, but if
Yeah.
if it's up high, it's
Yeah,
not
you're
comfortable.
good. Or if it's like way down in your lap, like all those things, right? Like you want the tray to be at a good height. I really like the ones that I liked starting with a tray situation and then having something that's removable that you can slide up to the table
Yep.
and things that are adjustable. So ones that like the seat and the footrest are adjustable is really
Mm-hmm.
great. And your kids grow with it, right? Both my 4-year-old and 2-year-old use our high chair. They fight over it. My 4-year-old doesn't like probably really need it, but it's we just like move the footrest, like whoever's turn it is, and we move it up
Oh
and
my
down.
gosh. I
It's
love
really
that.
fun.
Yeah, so like we
Um,
had been talking about it a little bit before this, and like we did like both of us are typically fans of the Stoke, however you say it, chair, which is the wooden one. And I think that yeah, there's so many knockoffs of it too, though. But essentially, like, yeah, like you said, I feel like the ones that have the adjustable footrest, the ones that can, the tray can be removed or put on. I like that brand though too, or like ones that are in that style because I think they're great because they have newborn attachments that you can have your kiddo in. That's like a seat they can be cushioned in. Then they can sit up in it. And then, like, you can do that for feeding and activities at the table too. And then eventually you take the newborn part off. And, like you said, like your kiddos are still using it too, right? And now it's like a high chair. So I feel like it's an all-in-one. It's just like those convertible car seats. They're great. They can fit them for so long.
yeah, and you definitely want that in the world of baby stuff
Oh
because
my
they have
gosh.
everything.
Otherwise, you're
So
buying things every other day, right?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I mean, high chair wise, you mean if you can also, right, like my 2-year-old often wants to like sit in my lap, but like so sitting, I mean, a 2-year-old is a little bit different, but like a baby, right? Like as long as they, you're kind of supporting them, like their back is to your chest, right, and their feet are in
Mm-hmm.
the chair kind of in front of you, right? They're still sort of in that same position. So like
Right.
they prefer that. If you prefer that, that's also a good, strategy you can use.
Great. Now, do you
Um,
have specific like actually cups too? Like as kiddos are learning like to sip from sippy cups or straw cups, or do you have cups or bowls? And I know that some of the utensils are really short and like nubby, and some of them are longer. Do you have specific suggestions or what people should look for in those types of things?
Yeah, definitely for cups. So there's a brand called, I think it's called like Easy Peasy, maybe.
Okay.
They make these cups that are like, they're 2 ounces. They almost look like little shot glasses, but they're silicone.
Yes, I know what you're talking
Um,
about.
and they're wonderful because, so with like introducing water, right? So for the first 12 months, baby actually doesn't really need water, but it's a good idea to start introducing cups. And it's actually great to start with an open cup, not a sippy cup.
Mm,
Um, because again, it's like about sort of like their oral motor development. And we don't actually need the skill of being able to drink from a sippy cup. We need the skill of drinking out of an open cup. So
right.
if you use these tiny little cups, first of all, they only hold so much water. So you're not going to like overdo it, right? So if you're
Right.
giving your baby like 2 ounces of water, you know, 4 ounces, like you don't want to you don't want to do a lot of water because we don't want to displace milk or anything like that. But a little bit for them to kind of get the idea behind it. You can have like show them, right? They can hold it with their two little hands. You can kind of put your hands around it, kind of guide it. You can
Yep.
demonstrate, how you do it, and then like be really obvious, like swallowing it and like putting the cup down, and they pick it up really fast.
They
It's
so
actually
do. Yeah.
remarkable.
I just pulled up the website so that we could say it's easy peasy, like the four letters.
Yeah.
And yes, I love their little cups. I've had lots of clients in myself and as well as like when I was working in the daycare have them. And then they also have the transitional ones with the straws, which are nice too. So if you do want something with a lid eventually, because kids throw things,
Yeah. And it's
then
good to
that's
learn to
nice.
drink from a straw. So like I would go for if you want a lidded thing, I'd go for a straw before I went from like a hard top like sippy cup.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um yeah, and I mean with the straw thing, I mean some kids just naturally kind of pick it up. They like figure out how to suck on it, but you can also get these like I think they're called like they're like a honey bear kind of looking.
Yes,
They
the honey
look like
bear
the
cups.
honey. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can kind of squeeze them. There are other ones that do this, but I just happen to know that one does it, where you can
Yep.
kind of squeeze it a little bit and make the water come out. So like you can show them the water is going to come out of this, right? You can kind
Yep.
of like they can have it in their mouth and you can gently squeeze it so that they can learn how to navigate. the straw as well.
That's
It's a
awesome.
good way.
Cool. I
Yeah.
love that. Um, that's amazing. I think that that kind of gives so much information. Are there any other things that you typically suggest that people do or look for when it comes to starting their feeding journeys, or, any tips and tricks that you would give everybody who's listening and about to go through it all?
Yeah, I think, you know, I don't know. I think we've covered a lot of the like
So
major tips
much.
and tricks. Honestly, I mean, this is so easier said than done, but like try to enjoy it and like
Yeah.
relax around it, right? It can be so stressful, but it can also be really fun, right? Like, I mean, lots of really funny things happen around feeding time.
Yeah.
If you're stressed, baby is likely to feel that. So
Mm-hmm.
trying to kind of like, get yourself ready for it by feeling prepared about the choking, like what to do in that case, right? If you're really stressed about like the mess, like feeling prepared by putting things down and covering things, like just as much as you can kind of prepare yourself to go into it feeling calm. And then, I mean, of course, if you do have concerns or if you have questions about it, like, reach out to somebody who can help you kind of like navigate it on that like individualized level because it's not one size fits all. And feeding is really personal, it's cultural, like so much goes into it. So,
Absolutely. Yeah, and reach out to Katie because I will have her information in the show notes below. But yeah, I think that that's so important, and yeah, definitely easier said than done to enjoy it in the moment, but it is exciting. Um, so that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all the information with everybody today. Like I said, I'll have your information in the notes below, so definitely check out Katie for, if you're starting solids, or also I know you do a lot with like picky eaters and like toddlers and whatnot as well, and also adults, right?
yeah, so if you're like concerned, about your own like eating habits kind of influencing your kids, that's something that yeah, like I work with
Yeah,
adults and like, there's a big trickle down effect. And
that's so
I
cool.
didn't say this at the beginning, but I do take insurance, which I know is
Oh,
often
yes, yes,
big,
yes.
like,
Always what people are looking for.
obviously.
Yeah, no, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Postpartum Plan podcast. I hope that today's episode brought you support, relatability, and valuable insight. Remember, you're not alone on this journey. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave a review and share with any of your prenatal and postpartum friends and family. Your feedback helps us reach more parents seeking support. And if you're looking for additional resources, please feel free to connect via Instagram at Serene Moments Doula for constant information, tips, and tricks, or check out my website, www.serenemomentsdoula.com. See you next week.